Hello YouTube, and welcome to Total War Attila. This will be sort of the first of my actual history-focused videos, rather than the sort of first look I was doing before of Total War Attila. Probably one of the few, because I don't know a huge deal about this time period. But some of the factions I do know a bit about, and so today we're going to be looking at the Huns. So I'll get into the map in a minute and start most of my talking. But just want to highlight for a minute a bit of the background behind their abilities here. So Scourge of God, as most people will know, is the title that Attila the Hun either took for himself or was given, probably a combination of both. And basically, and the effect is it gives a huge morale penalty to the Christian factions of the game, which is mostly Rome and any converted barbarians. This is Attila the Hun. He specifically created this sort of aura of terror around him. The Huns were a rather brutal people, less brutal than what the sources say about them, probably, and what we think of them now, having a rather biased image of them due to our societies spring off those they conquered for the most part. But he certainly did some very brutal things, did not really distinguish between combatant and non-combatant, and had no concept of just war or anything of the kind. And he himself is thought to have even played up these stories to generate terrible fear in his enemies. Similar to the legacy of Genghis Khan, I guess, who did very similar things several hundred years later whenever he came along. Terrify your enemies and it gives you a pretty big advantage against them. He was helped in a lot of ways by how alien his culture was to most of the people here. I'll get into more of that when I get to the map. And then this one, which is rather cool as far as these bonuses go, Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So in the Bible, in Revelation, it talks about the apocalypse, what is thought to be the end times in Christian thinking, and various seals and so forth that will precede it. And the first of these seals are 4 seals which release 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And at the time, the Christian nations facing this inexorable, unbeatable horde of Huns had thought is to be a seal of the apocalypse. Specifically the first seal, which is the Horseman of Conquest, which is described as a horseman on a white horse, given a bow and sent out to conquer the nations of the earth, which is certainly something Attila did, and various interpretations of Revelation still held that he was the first seal of the apocalypse. And these, we see that there in Conquest, but then the next 3 are War, Famine, and Death, which are the other 3 bonuses on this little faction bonus thing that he gets. So yeah, I think that's just a nice little touch, bit of flavour to their bonuses. Anyway, let's get into it. As you'll notice, I was playing on normal. In Total War, I like to play the game on normal because it's sort of balanced in its view. No cheating AI. Anyway, I'll watch this.
The air was filled with smoke and blood. The Huns gloried in the stench of death. They took what they needed and left their enemies to rot. The Huns were free. They rode and fought and lived. Fear built Roman walls. They were right to be afraid. And behold, a red horse, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth. Those with gold offered it by the wagon. The Huns took it and allowed them to live in fear, at least until they returned. The riders of the Four Winds prayed to him of the eternal sky. They made ready for war. Hailing from the eastern steppes, yours is a life of constant movement and conflict. Your arrival has driven many from their homelands in fear. The Goths have fled southwestwards. Give chase, and you will find the fertile lands of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Vandals run west. There you will find the Western Roman Empire, weaker than its eastern cousin, but perhaps easier to exploit. Southeast lies the wealthy Sassanid Empire, ripe for plundering. Before you take on the supposed masters of the civilized world, you will do well to strengthen your position by subjugating the northern tribes. The world will dance to your tune, or it will burn.
Alright, so that was a pretty cool intro there actually. Gave a good overview of the Huns. So, here we are at the Huns' starting position, which is pretty much all in Ukraine at the moment, I think. So the Crimean Peninsula is there, this is the Black Sea, Turkey's there, Greece is sort of down here. So the Huns, no one really knows where they came from. It's most likely that they came from... I don't have the drawing tools, that sucks. They came from sort of, I think, around here, near the Caspian Sea. Actually, it might even be here. They came from the sort of Kazakhstan area, so the more Asiatic steppes, somewhere in this area. So if you look for Kazakhstan on a map, that's about where they're thought to come from. And so that puts them as... The main thing about the Huns from the perspective of these civilized nations, one of the things that made them so terrifying was that they were very alien to them. Horse nomads were not really new. They were still pretty mysterious because they had little contact with civilized nations, but by this point Europe had found several waves of them. So you have the Cimmerians were probably the first. They sort of settled around in this sort of area pretty early on in the Bronze Age, because they got, it's thought, a lot of the horse tribes, they're thought to have pretty much just been a non-ending push from further eastward. So powerful groups would arise out in the more eastern and Russian steppes, and they would push into the very fertile lands of Ukraine and down even more down into here, into the Hungarian sort of areas. Not quite sure where Hungary is, but It's also another area with fertile plains. And there were just sort of waves of horsemen crashing into each other and forcing the previous owners out. So that happened to the Cimmerians here, and they settled around in these northern Black Sea areas, becoming quite sedentary by the time of the Roman era, when we start getting better records. And the Scythians, or Scythians would be how it's properly pronounced, started to be mentioned. So the Scythians were more Iranian sort of people, not as in they were from Iran down here, but that they were more Middle Eastern in genetics and ancestry and so forth. Turkic, that's the word I mean. So they weren't so Asian like the Mongols or the Huns, well, what the Huns probably were, but were more related to the nations of Persia and so forth, and obviously the once nomadic Turks that came down in the Middle Ages. And then sort of during the Scythians also came in the late Bronze Age, I think, but they sort of stuck around a bit more. But then you have the Sarmatians appear into these western regions. So the Roxolani in Rome too were the Sarmatians. They're one of the Sarmatian tribes. Now, the actual differences and delineations between the tribes we don't really know, because our sources are from the civilized areas, predominantly Greek. Herodotus is a good source for a lot of that stuff. And then later the Romans. And they hadn't really been to the steppes, didn't really know them. Scythians were a bit more well known because they had actually, lots of them had settled, others stayed. Because none of these were nations per se, they were tribal coalitions and just sort of various family groups loosely formed together. It's only under various leaders such as Attila and Genghis that these tribal coalitions sort of really united and became an empire with rather devastating effect, really. So you have the Sarmatians, and I think the Alans, I should have looked up how to say that name. They came in a bit later, during the later Roman period, whether they were sort of part of Sarmatians or not. And eventually the Sarmatians came to dominate the Scythians, either by cultural assimilation or just pushing the Scythians down into these areas. And then the Alans did likewise to the Sarmatians. And so I wonder what they are in this game actually. They're another faction I want to play. I haven't played much of this game yet. But yeah, they're also a horse tribe that was in here. Now the Sarmatians and the Alans were actually rather Germanic, sort of Nordic blood, it's thought. They're described as being blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and so forth. So they were probably more originally from up in these... it's a bit hard because I don't actually have... there it is on this map. So probably more from these sort of northern regions, sort of near Scandinavia, eastern Germany, probably modern day Minsk and Lithuania and so forth. Either that or pretty much they probably came south more than east. So Turkic peoples were more east into here, and then your Asiatic ones are well over here in Kazakhstan and Mongolia, which is probably further over than that, but north of China. And then the Alans were here, and then the Huns started coming towards the end of the Roman period. And they were around a long time before Attila. They sort of moved into here, as I said, probably from Kazakhstan, and had been moving across for a while there. And they began to push into here, into this Ukrainian area. And eventually they sort of base themselves over in the Hungarian plains, which I think is here-ish. And that became sort of their main homeland and base of operations there. But unlike other tribes before them, they seem to have dominated those behind them and kept control of these areas as well. So pushing all the other barbarians such as the Visigoths and Alans and so forth forwards ahead of them like a wave. So the Huns were very alien to the people of this time. Not much was known about them in that early period, and then not much continued to be known about them for quite a long time afterwards. They were different to the tribes before them, and they were a race that would not have been, if they were indeed Asiatic, which is how this game's chosen to portray them, and they were a race that not many people would have had contact with. There was trade contact between the Roman Empire and China, for example, but that wouldn't mean that many people had seen it, let alone seen an Asiatic sort of people. But in terms of culture, they were probably pretty similar to a lot of the other horse nomads that were before them. So in terms of way of life, I mean, more than culture. So a horse nomad, essentially their life is a lot of...
For the tribe!
They spend most of their life mounted. And they, rather than having a city and sort of farming the land around that, or a town, what they would do is that they would take their homes with them and just move around countryside for, well, forever really. And I'm not they have sort of areas they'd often stick around with, but not a whole, they were quite mobile, so sometimes they'd go to new areas if it wasn't a very fertile year or so forth. So they'd live in tents, mostly, like those round yurts that you saw in Attila's camp in the intro. And they'd just move around throughout the year. Most were probably pastoral nomads, which meant that they had various livestock animals with them, such as sheep and so forth. Horses, they also used horses for milk and meat, though horses were more useful than just a mere food source to them. But you still see that in countries today, like Hungary, which was sort of formed by the Huns, was sort of what happened to them after their empire collapsed. But those countries like that still use horse milk and eat horse meat and so forth, which is taboo in a lot of other Western nations. So they pretty much farmed on the move, followed their herds, led their herds to the best pastures. And if they're anything like the Mongolians, they would actually live in throughout most of the year they wouldn't be together in large groups. They would sort of be in extended families with another extended family about 1 kilometer or so in another direction, and so forth, and just sort of loosely travel around together while maintaining some sort of loose tribal formation where the men and elders of each family would meet up at various points, and if there were issues that needed to be addressed, they would address them at those meetings and so forth. Not too unlike how all the other nations of the time worked, just separated by a lot more distance. And these groups would travel around throughout their territory over the year. They also would have done a lot of hunting on their steppes. That's why horse tribes are almost invariably horse archers. It's because that was their way of hunting. Out on the plains, you can't stalk and ambush prey, and you can't even really run it down so much on foot. So they had to adapt by taking on, once they domesticated the horse, which happened quite early actually for these nomadic tribes, and then spread to the other tribes, spread from nomadic tribes over into other nations. So nomadic tribes were the first to domesticate the horse, again probably around this Ukraine area. It's quite important historically for these cultures. Once they domesticated the horse, they could keep up with the various prey animals such as deer and so forth, which gave them a lot more advantage in being able to do so. So they could hunt from horseback with the bow, get close to the animal and shoot it down. Now this gave them a very good and very hard to counter way of doing war when they did come to war, and when it's been first encountered by a civilization, it was always devastating. When the Cimmerians first came in and decided to attack the civilized nations during the early Bronze Age, they caused a lot of destruction, and not sure exactly how much they came from, but I know they got down as far as Israel down here, sort of ravaging and pillaging the various towns. Probably they were always more given to raiding and so forth than actual conquest. Possibly it could just be for riches. It could also just be they had a bad year and so needed to get food or starve. A lot of raiding did often just spring from that. Wars are normally fought over resources a lot more, or at least when resources are scarce, people will fight over them. Other times it is for conquest, personal glory, various things, such as what the Huns eventually sort of became. As I was saying, they would hunt from horseback and often in groups as well. So you pretty much have your method of war right there. Groups of men under small groups or larger groups under a commander, sort of the hunt leader, that were trained to sort of surround and drive the prey towards others and so forth. Tactics which could be used to devastating effect on the battlefield, where you would surround the enemy, shoot them from all sides, sort of herd them. Certainly how the Mongols came to conquer, and the other horse tribes would likely work in much the same way. Now, also, I'm not sure if they would also have used lances and so forth during their hunting. Your more civilized nations did. I don't know what nation it would have been under at the time, but sort of this age, or slightly later, Britons and Franks would hunt from lance, hunt with a lance on horseback, and so forth. So the Huns were possibly even trained in their mounted warfare through hunting as well, but definitely trained in horsemanship. And you can actually, the ancient writers weren't exaggerating all too much when they said they were in the saddle almost from birth and pretty much merged with their horses. We can see from early skeletons that both men and women spent so much time in the saddle, that from the very early ages, about 6 or lower, that they spent significant times on horseback, and it left them with various things such as bowed legs and other little anatomical deformations that show that they spent almost as much time mounted as unmounted in their way of life. And as I mentioned there, we also see reasonable evidence of women having a part in the horsemanship of this culture. How much that translated to war and hunting and various other disciplines is unknown, but from those early Volga River cultures and through to the Sarmatians, when Herodotus talks about the Sarmatians, he gives us stories about one of their queens, for example, and the Scythians are thought to have spawned the myths about the Amazons, which, if you've ever seen a painted jar of an Amazon, you can sort of see that influence in them, the sort of pointy cap and kind of pajama-looking outfits that we see in games like Rome Total War and so forth. You also see on those jars of the Amazons. So, very likely that they were the inspiration behind those myths. And there's, of course, tombs with women buried with chariots and horses and weapons and so forth around this area. But again, the question of how much is a bit more unknown.
Sit, share my fire.
Anyway, so the Huns had moved from their homeland over here for various reasons. I should mention also that it is sometimes thought that they're linked with a culture called the Xiongnu, who were a nomadic tribe that harassed early China and was the cause for the Great Wall and so forth. It's a little loose. There is no actual evidence that that happened other than being roughly the same time and area. But that could just as easily have been any of the other horse tribes around, early Mongols, for example. But it is a possibility that the Huns are that same nation, and then as China got better at defending, they moved westward in search of easier plunder. But yeah, they moved from the west and started settling. At the time, as the game's starting here, we're in Ukraine, and eventually they would move down and base themselves in this plain here, while seeming to maintain a hold of this land between them. Let's see how we're going with time. I'll probably stop this video there and continue in the next.